Good evening, my children.
Oh yeah, fuck, I'm not wearing a Halloween costume. I can't do this bit. Look, I'm very underprepared right now because life is life. But we're gonna do a Halloween video, people. And I'm a comic book channel, so I have to do a Halloween-y comic. And what better place than the 1970s? We're talking about ourselves a Marvel franchise people don't know is a Marvel franchise. And also Marvel's first anime. We're talking about Tomb of Dracula. Okay, I'm gonna not do so many bits during this thing, I promise. Let's jam. What's there to say about Tomb of Dracula? It's a comic you probably haven't heard about, or at least if you did, you might not know why it's a big deal, or why it is a thing. Well, I'm here to tell you, as a person on the internet, why this comic is good. Okay, you know Christopher Lee Hammer horror films? Imagine if that was a TV show. And that's Tomb of Dracula. There! Okay. Not exactly. I'll tell you this. Tomb of Dracula was actually one of my favorite comics. When I was a young lad, my uncle had this huge collection of various comics. And a bunch of issues he had was Tomb of Dracula. And I just really got into them. I read them. They were so much fun. As a kid, it was just this exciting horror title with this large ham of a character called Dracula going around being dramatic and telling people they are fools. How dare they defy him?
Fool! Nothing has been decided yet. The battle's still going on.
What? Are you sure about that?
Fool! Of course I am.
Does that mean you can see what's going on inside?
Fool! Silence! I require a cup of tea before I deign to answer that.
How about coffee instead?
Fool! I said tea, and I mean tea.
This guy.
You know, classic supervillain monster stuff. And he was the main draw. It was a fun book to read over the summer, during Halloween. My uncle had a bunch of these issues, so it ended up forming a huge bond to me. But let's actually explain the comic and how it came about. Let's talk about the ban on horror. Now, I'm going to go over some comic history everybody kind of talks about, but we're going to go into some nitty-gritty. Back during the 1950s, the comic book companies decided to make a code so that way the government couldn't censor them and also cut out the competition, EC Comics. It was mostly to cut down on EC Comics, but to also prevent government interference, and so Archie can basically throw its giant dick at the comic book industry. Again, I'm going into a lot of weird details here, and I rather focus. Anyway, because of this, it meant that no supernatural horror could be a thing. Now, horror didn't exactly go away. What it was replaced by was tended to be science fiction horror. Alien invasions, monsters, body snatchers. Again, it was supernatural horror. You couldn't do vampires, werewolves, or zombies. Well, they kind of did zombies, believe it or not, but that's another thing entirely. Anyway, it led to a lot of weird things during this era. For one thing, you know the X-Men villain Sauron? Have you ever wondered why he's a giant pterodactyl man? Have you ever wondered why? Okay, this is going to sound dumb. So initially, he was actually going to be a vampire who sucked the life out of mutants and was a giant bat. But the comic code didn't like that. So they had to redraw him. And the only thing that they thought could be similar was a pterodactyl. And that's why Sauron's a giant pterodactyl man, and we just accept it. That's how that happened. That's why he's a giant pterodactyl man. That was the 60s, people. That's what you had to do if you wanted to be published in comics. It was a very weird era. Anyway, that's just to kind of give you an idea of what the code was like. Now, for various reasons, restrictions started to get lifted around the 70s. So, you could do supernatural horror again in the 70s. Again, it didn't necessarily kill genres. As time went on, more and more stuff did get lifted over time, though it did significantly hurt a lot of things. Now, to talk about this meant that supernatural horror came back with a vengeance. It's why we got characters like Ghost Rider, Son of Satan, Man-Thing, Swamp Thing, House of Secrets, House of Mystery. Again, horror did come back into comics. And that's not even getting into the magazine booms of the time, which weren't technically affected by the comic code. But again, this was the 70s. A lot of this stuff was happening at the same time. So, with all that said, Tomb of Dracula bursted on the scene and helped launch Marvel horror. Now, there were other titles like Werewolf by Night, Frankenstein, and The Living Mummy. Yes, Marvel could technically create its own dark universe. I know. They also have their own Invisible Man. Anyway, moving on from that, though. Tomb of Dracula was launched on the feet of Gary Conway and Gene Colan. They were both given the task to do the title, and Gary sets up the initial thing. It starts with protagonist Frank Drake, who might be one of the most pathetic Marvel protagonists ever, but I kinda love him. He's a descendant of Dracula. And this schmuck goes to his castle and awakens Dracula, forcing a bunch of people to go like, oh, Dracula's awake. We should probably kill him. And we're off to the races of adventure as Frank tries to kill Dracula. Kinda. That's kind of the initial premise of the comic, but it doesn't last long. Now, the main writer of the series, Marv Wolfman, does not come in till issue 7, but Gene Colan is there from issue 1. So it actually does pay to read from the beginning, I would say, because for one, Gene Colan is an amazing fucking artist. If any of his pieces are just beautiful works. His Tomb of Dracula stuff? Yeah, I could stare at that for days. Beautiful work, even in color, is in black and white. Yeah, no, the comic is a gorgeous book from the 70s. And the black and white magazine art he did, all of it. I just really appreciate this run, if only for how much Gene Colan nailed the hell out of this book. Now, again, it was also a monthly title, so rushing it was common. But fuck, I love this book. It looks good. So, what's the deal with the comic? Well, besides after the changes happen. And the changes do happen. You see, as soon as Frank Drake, the comic tries to make Frank Drake basically be like the protagonist for a while, but soon it becomes kind of obvious Dracula's cooler. So what they do is that they start incorporating elements. First, they introduce Rachel Van Helsing. She's like Batman and has a bow. And the arch enemy of Dracula, Quincy Parker, who basically is in a wheelchair, and his wheelchair can shoot stakes at Dracula. He is fucking cool. And so far, like I said, we're kind of off to the races on there. And throughout the series, they try to go after Dracula, but they also don't appear for stretches at a time. While they're there, they're not necessarily always the heroes. Some issues, it's just Dracula, and Dracula doing things. Or another character tries to fight Dracula. I should also mention something. This is published by Marvel Comics. Yes, it is set in the Marvel Universe. Yes, he does fight Spider-Man. Yes, he also fights the Silver Surfer. Now you might be asking, why does Dracula fight the Silver Surfer? And I can say, fuck you, why not? But besides that, and everything else, the comic focuses mostly on Dracula trying to scheme on how he's going to take over, how he will grow more powerful, and how his plans will come to fruition. It's a book where it's a give and take. Because Dracula's not always triumphant, but Dracula doesn't always lose either. It's a very give and take book at times. And this book would also introduce a lot of actual kind of vampire lore. For one thing, it introduces urban fantasy's favorite genre, the vampire detective. Yeah, the first vampire detective actually came in Tomb of Dracula, Hannibal King. It's a really good issue, too. The entire issue is told specifically from Hannibal King's perspective. And we see him do stuff that is a little off until the reveal that the reason why he's getting involved with the vampire business is that he is a vampire. But that's not the only thing either. Because this comic also is famous for introducing another character. And I guess we're going to have to go skating uphill. Yeah, this comic introduces Blade. Yeah, Blade actually first shows up in this book. In a pretty major role, too. As the guy who's hunting Dracula. Now, let me describe the original Blade. Imagine if a blaxploitation hero from the 70s ended up in a Hammer film. No, it's not Blackula, but it's close. Blade comes in, and he kind of just is this weird, unique contrast to Dracula. A very modern concept against this classical vampire archetype. It's what makes it kind of fun if you're reading it. Again, now Blade is kind of like, an older stereotype, but it's kind of also fun too. Seeing like two film archetypes like this, a blaxploitation hero and a classical Hammer horror vampire character fighting it out, that's a cool contrast. Now, while Blade isn't Wesley Snipes yet, he's kind of fun. He's brash, out there, a little goofy. The comic version, the 70s version of Blade, is interesting. Though he isn't a Damphyr yet. At the time, he only had one thing going for him. He was immune to vampire bites. Man, how characters change and evolve over the decades. Wait till we get to the 90s. Anyway, Blade was introduced in this book, and he doesn't become like a major character, but Marvel did see potential in the character even at the time. He was actually given his own solo spin-off stories around it in various magazines. He didn't get a major main title till way later, but still, they were at least trying him out, and he was in the comic. In fact, he has very memorable team up with the character Hannibal King, the vampire detective. Again, all good stuff. But anyway, let's talk about what the comic is really about. Dracula is trying to basically fight against the world. You see, Dracula's life has been screwed ever since, he became a vampire. He's basically been trying to fight for power, vengeance, and everything in between. This guy basically has also destroyed so many lives. In the comic, you get to see the death of Quincy's daughter by Dracula. You get to see everything he does. The comic is a little bit sympathetic for Dracula, but it doesn't go completely, no, Dracula is just a good, no, Dracula is kind of a terrible person at times. But that's also what makes the comic fun. It's this guy who basically just destroys lives over the top. It is a fun book if you're willing to, have some flights of fancy with it. And James Cullen's very misty art style adds to it, giving the comic kind of an atmosphere of an old movie. And there are so many fun stuff in this. For one thing, like I said, some people have issues with the idea of Dracula having to interact with the Marvel Universe. Personally, the low point is when he had to interact with Brother Voodoo, the Aquaman of the Marvel Universe. Now, you might be like, why is Brother Voodoo the Aquaman of the Marvel Universe? And I'm not going to tell you today. We're just going to move on. But Tomb of Dracula had him fight Spider-Man. It also had him fight other characters. My personal favorite is the fight with Doctor Strange. Two characters who go very well together. It's a very good crossover between the two. And you get, while it doesn't actually kill Dracula, it does give him connection and is one of my favorite bits in the entire run. You also, again, have him fight the Silver Surfer, which I can only describe as kind of, oh, so bad it's good. Like, come on, Dracula fighting the Silver Surfer? I mean, how could I not love it? Why? It exists, it's there. But the Tomb of Dracula series is kind of divided up into eras as well. Keep in mind, this comic was going on bi-monthly throughout all the 70s. So this comic kind of lasted about 10 years or so. A very long-lasting title with a lot of room. The reason it actually lasted so long was that it got very popular in Britain. And I mean it. It was a popular book there. And it lasted enough to get magazines and a lot of spin-off material, too. For one thing, his daughter Lilith became a very major character in Marvel, too. For a while, at least. And plus, you know, she's a sexy vampire girl. Sexy vampire girls. Always very popular.
Let me show you the deep, raw passion of unbridled sexual frenzy.
But you see, I'm British.
And all that jazz. It is such, it's impressive how much stuff was fit into this. And like I said, it had vampire detectives, Frank Drake being a pussy, Rachel Van Helsing going down, becoming more of a monster. That gets explored later on in subsequent series too. And Quincy Harker, oh my god, the final battle with him and Quincy Harker. Now, the series does eventually kind of wrap up eventually in the Boston era. The Boston era is a weaker era. It definitely doesn't end necessarily all that graceful. For one thing, they introduce this really bad comedic side character. I forget the name, but imagine Woody Allen, and it's not that good. But it does have a great final issue. Quincy Harker has several fights with Dracula throughout the series. One of my favorite fights in the entire series is where basically Quincy Harker arms his entire house against Dracula, including his fucking pool table.
I love this train.
It is an amazing sequence. And the final fight with Dracula's castle where it explodes is such a proper finale. For whatever the problems with the comic were at that time, the strength of the finale kind of almost makes up for it. Now, there were good bits in the comic's final years. I actually really like how Dracula lost his powers and was basically like, oh god, I'm human. Oh no. Oh god, I like hamburgers. What is my life? Yeah, Dracula eats a hamburger, people. I don't know. It's a very somber moment, and the comic does a very good job of reminding you stuff. And Dracula trying to get a life again, trying to have kids in this era. It's a very interesting era, maybe not for everyone. And it does get pretty crazy with the introduction of Janice, I will admit. The angel baby thing. Half vampire. There's a lot of things to explain in this run sometimes. But I recommend Tomb of Dracula. It's an exciting comic that I think is pretty solid. It's a very much Marvel Bronze Age. One issue with it, too, is that Marv Wolfman like I said, was an editor at the time. And when you're an editor and a writer, oh boy, sometimes you don't check your own stuff well. And that really sucks, but it does lead to some inconsistencies later on. Something you should keep in mind, but it's a fun comic. If you like weird, gothic stuff, well, Tomb of Dracula is perfect. I would also recommend, maybe if you can find it, the essential Tomb of Dracula. Besides some censorship in later volumes, the black and white version of the comic is really beautiful to look at. It's a very good... Gene Colan's art, oh, it's so good. So good. It might actually be better in black and white, but I'll let you decide on that yourself. It's a good book either way. But there's one other aspect to talk about with Tomb of Dracula. The actual anime. How to introduce this anime. Cue the Dragon Ball opening. Now, let's talk about that. Why did I play the Dragon Ball opening? Well, let me talk about this. Marvel and Japan in the 70s did have a relationship. I'm sure people know about Japanese Spider-Man. Okay, look. Toei and Marvel brokered several deals back in the 70s and worked together on various projects. Super Sentai actually does come from this deal. So yes, Marvel had a hand in helping Power Rangers grow to an extent. Not completely, but it's there. That's not even getting to Marvel working with the Shogun Warriors, which was several Toei Super Robot shows. Again, it's there. But yeah, no, like, yeah, there was a collaboration. Spider-Man was one, and there was also various attempts to do other types. A major one was going to be Moon Knight. That didn't happen. Yes, Moon Knight could have gotten a tokusatsu like Kamen Rider, and the 3D Man. I'm not going to talk about the 3D Man. Anyway, needless to say, Toei and Marvel were in a working relationship, and, well, it led to them working on this, the Tomb of Dracula, or I should be known as Dracula, Sovereign of the Damned. What is this movie? It exists? Okay. Now, the reason I played Dragon Ball was not because it's anime. No, this was literally worked on by several Dragon Ball people. The director is the main director for Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump. Yeah, small world. The screenwriter, the Japanese screenwriter, I should say, also worked on Ashita no Joe and Hoshi no Giants, aka the first sports anime, or at least the first baseball, and I'll check that later. Anyway, this is actually a pretty stacked list of people here. This was pre-Dragon Ball, so technically isn't when it was made, but, you know, Dragon Ball and Dr. Slump aren't small titles. They're very important to anime culture, in my opinion. And, I mean, this isn't Dragon Ball Z, but it's Dragon Ball. Goku. Adventure. Red Ribbon Army. All that jazz. Was directed by the guy who did Dracula, Sovereign of the Damned. Alright, how do I sum up this movie? Have you ever heard of an anime compilation film? Anime compilation films are often anime films made up of various TV shows that condense the storyline into a 2-hour chunk of movie. Now, Gundam is famous for its movie trilogy, Space Battleship Yamato, and there's a couple other ones that have done similar things. Again, it's not an unusual tactic in of itself. And there's also been movies that have been that were basically started out as full anime TV shows, but ended up as, well, movies. Dracula, Sovereign of the Damned basically feels like an anime compilation film to a series that never existed. But it kind of did exist, because it is very much based on the comic, and my god, what they had to change to make it all fit is kind of crazy. Okay, let's talk about this. So, it starts off with a cult trying to summon Satan, and Dracula's like... As you can see, it then cuts back to Frank Drake listening to the TV and being like, I should mention, this is Frank Drake, who is in the comic, but he is very much in anime protagonist mode right now. Yeah, he looks like a 70s anime character. Kind of crazy, honestly. So, the movie goes on about and starts faffing about with them, as soon as Hans Harker finds Dracula and is like, and again, the movie feels like a compilation film. Like, there's entire chunks cut out. Like, it feels like sometimes we're watching scenes that were just chopped down from TV show episodes. Maybe this was going to be a TV show at one point, but I doubt it. Either way, it's trying to condense 70 comics into a 2-hour movie. And that means it combines various eras. At the end of the comic, Dracula's basically fighting demons, so it's trying to do that, while also introducing stuff from the first part of the comic, and it cuts out a lot of stuff. Like, I'm sorry people, we don't get Anime Blade. Anime Blade will later exist, but he's not in the movie yet. Tragic. But, besides Anime Blade... this movie is just weird, because it also tries to adapt the Janice subplot stuff, and the Janice subplot stuff isn't exactly the best written stuff in the comic either, but trying to adapt it for this movie is kind of insane. The Ferris wheel bit, all that jazz.
Die, vampire!
My baby! Janus, no! You shot my baby! Oh, my baby! Oh, Janus!
I didn't mean to do it!
It even tries to adapt Dracula losing his powers, and you get the scene of Dracula eating the hamburger, which doesn't work so much as in the anime. It works in the comics actually pretty well, better than you would expect. But in the movie, oh god, no, it's Dracula eating a hamburger. There's also weird, like, little flashes of interesting stuff, like Dracula's teeth, and blah, blah, blah. I make fun of this movie to an extent, but it's also kind of entertaining. It has a dub from Harmony Gold, too, that is also interesting to hear about. It's not a bad dub at times. Some of the voice work is okay, but it's kind of a very stilted, very quick-paced movie. It's not gonna win anybody's favorite anime of all time, but it has some interesting stuff. And like I said, it was made by the Dragon Ball people, which, again, is not something it's something I had to look up. I decided to actually look up who worked on the damn film, and yeah, no, it was the Dragon Ball people. So again, that's kind of interesting historical stuff to me. But again, it's an odd film. I'm sure my editor is putting in clips right now with just some odd stuff he found in the frickin' film.
You don't even know the half of it.
No!
Let's go get him.
Again, it's a very unique film, and you might want to do it if you want, like, a good riffable movie. If you want, like, a weird piece of anime history, yeah, no, Marvel's first anime. They have another one, too, actually, that didn't come out too late. Frankenstein was also a movie. And don't ask me how that happened. I still need to see that. But yeah, Tomb of Dracula got an anime, of all things, and was the first anime Marvel thing to get an anime, which boggles the mind. But Spider-Man did get the first tokusatsu, and he had a giant robot. He was the winner of this. But yeah, Tomb of Dracula anime is weird, it's wild, it's crazy, and it's called Sovereign of the Damned, I know, but Tomb of Dracula is just easier to say to me, so I'm just going to call it the Tomb of Dracula anime. But yeah, no, like, if we could just... it's condensing 70 fucking comics. Of course, it also cuts out the Silver Surfer fight. Truly the greatest loss of our generation. Truly it is. It also cuts out the fights of Spider-Man, his daughter, Doctor Strange, the entire, like, zombie arc. So much good stuff. And we also don't get to see Brother Voodoo in animation. Tisk, tisk. But, alas, that's how it is. The Dracula Sovereign of the Damned anime is basically, like I said, an anime compilation movie. If you go in knowing that, it's a little bit easier to understand. Because you can kind of imagine all the places a TV show would have put more stuff in. But it is what it is. We got it. It's a movie about Dracula fighting Satan, his angelic son, and crazy sequences. But to leave it off, I think one of the things is what the comic says. I think, because I really like the final word of the comic. Dracula was a man, and he was a hell of a man. The comic is a good time. The anime is whack. But check it out. It's fun. It's on YouTube. Have a good time. And have a happy Halloween. Like, share, and subscribe.